Coming up on ReFramed.
Along with this week's special guest, Luke Christian. Today we'll be discussing Queer as Folk, which I'm so excited to do.
Sleigh bells ring, are you listening? Now I'm deaf.
The episode that we're probably going to talk a lot about, which is aptly titled, Fuck Disabled People.
You're quite skeptical about something.
Love the sex positivity, all about that.
Yes. Welcome back to ReFramed, the podcast that reframes how disability is portrayed in film and TV. I'm your host, Jason Climo, and today I have the lovely as ever Stephanie Dow with me as my co-host, along with this week's special guest, Luke Christian. Today we'll be discussing Queer as Folk, which I'm so excited to do. But before we do, let's say hey to Luke and learn a little bit more about them. So welcome to the podcast, Luke. Did you want to start off by just letting us all know a bit about you and what you do?
Hi everyone, so my name is Luke Christian. I'm deaf. I was born deaf, and the deaf gene in the family goes back at least 6 or 7 generations. So it's me, my mum, my sister, grandma, uncle, cousin. So it's a really strong gene within my family history on my mum's side. And for me growing up, I didn't really know which sort of world I fit into, whether that was the deaf world or the hearing world, and people would always tell me how I should be, how I should act, as a deaf person. So about 3 years ago, I set up my own deaf fashion brand called Deaf Identity. And it was just a brand that I wanted to sort of like break down barriers and smash the old stigmas and just sort of make deafness fun, modern and relevant in today's society, and just sort of raise deaf awareness but in like a cool sort of way. So that's what I do. So business has been running now for 3 years. Just moved into my own office, so it's growing steady and it's been great so far.
Amazing.
So cool.
I know Jason and I were maybe doing a bit of a scroll through your shop recently and just loving the shirts, and like so good. Love it. Can't Christmas list sorted.
There were so many funny puns.
Love them.
Yeah, and that's the thing, like I tried to come up with, funny sort of deaf related phrases, and there was one that was like a bit tongue-in-cheek, and it was basically for a Valentine's launch, and it was the only thing that's turned on are my hearing aids, and that was just like smash hit, and everyone just loves that one. So it's been really great.
I think there was one about like, it's a quote from a song and it's like the sleigh bells are ringing or something, and you're like, are they? I can't hear them.
Yeah.
It's sleigh bells ring, are you listening? Now I'm deaf. Just like deadpan, just straight. Yeah, no, that's been a really good one for Christmas as well.
Do you come up with all of those yourself?
Yeah. So it's weird because sometimes I could just be like sat eating a bag of crisps, just watching TV, and then all of a sudden a phrase just pops into my head, and then I just get it out. So
and you're like, I have to put that on a jumper.
From everywhere.
Yeah.
I love it. I mean, obviously, I think that for me is what advocacy can do, is, in that fun, I think we'll relate to it and connect to it in a much better, more emotional way. So I love that. I try and implement that into my own work where I can. But speaking of sort of, how we tell our own stories and I guess like take charge of those narratives, why do you think it's so important that we do see that authentic representation in things like film and TV?
I think it's really important because when I was growing up, and I don't want to like offend anyone, but when I was growing up, people in society used to think that being deaf was sort of related for people that were slightly mature, slightly old, and it's something that you just naturally get as you get older. And something that I was really conscious of when I launched the business was to make it so that it appealed to all different ages. Like I was born deaf, and so many other deaf young people, they were born deaf as well. So I think it's really important in the media to see people like yourself, and then you can relate to them, and then it feels like you're included and that you're just not the only one on planet Earth, just doing your own thing. Like there are other people out there. And what I love about social media, and I know that some people find it negative and it can be quite a dark space for some people, but for me, it's allowed me to connect with so many different deaf people all around the world. So yeah, no, it's been great, but I think that definitely more needs to be done in terms of deaf characters on TV. And I'm gay, and I think it's important that, you know, film and directors or whatever push more of a narrative of different intersectionalities within the deaf world, because I think some people think that, oh, they're deaf and then that's it. But it's like, for me, I'm deaf and I'm gay, and then there's lots of other intersectionalities as well. So I think just keep it growing and keep expanding.
Yeah, it's so important to see intersectionality and also those complex characters. Like, we're not just disabled people or deaf people. Like, we are interested in things, we have issues, sometimes we're terrible people. Like, there's so much more to us.
It's almost like we're human beings. It's weird, right?
Right.
It's like we actually have lives. Like, how weird is that? You know what I mean?
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to review Queer as Folk now with you. Steph, did you just want to kick us off and give us the rundown on Queer as Folk?
Yeah. So the show, which is actually a reboot of a 90s British and US series with the same name. The show follows a group of club-going friends in New Orleans who are dealing with the aftermath of a shooting at a queer nightclub. So we're definitely throwing back to some real-world examples back then. The reason that we're actually talking about it today on ReFramed is two of the ensemble cast are actually disabled characters played by, thankfully, disabled actors. Julian, who has cerebral palsy, he's played by Ryan O'Connell, who you may know from the Netflix series Special. And then we've also got Marvin, who's an amputee and wheelchair user, and he's played by Eric Grace, I hope I'm saying that right. We'll find out. But yeah, I have a lot of interesting thoughts about the show sort of as a whole, but also the representation. So I'm keen to hear what you both think, but Jason, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, and I'm interested to hear your interesting thoughts, because I feel like you're quite skeptical about something. Like, you've got something sneaky going on.
I might play devil. Oh, well, not necessarily sneaky, but it's an interesting show. It's an interesting show to talk about, but we'll get to my thoughts. Let's hear your thoughts first.
Well, first up, I think it's amazing that we have a disabled main character, a disabled recurring character, and then we also have Nyle Dimarco, who appears in one episode as well. So we have 3 disabled characters throughout this season of the show. We also have intersectionality, obviously, that each of those characters are queer and disabled, obviously, but we also have a queer disabled person of color. So I think that's also like a whole other thing that we can kind of celebrate and talk about, because, as I like to say a lot of the time, the representation that disabled people get is usually the like most palatable version of a disabled person, being that it's like a straight white guy or a straight white girl. And, a lot of the time it's quite two-dimensional too, like they're not complex, interesting characters. Whereas in this, they were like very complex. I think the word messy was used in interviews, which I thought was quite funny and quite true. And I was like, I can get a bit messy, so can relate. So I think there's a lot to kind of celebrate. Also worth pointing out that Ryan O'Connell was listed as an executive producer. Don't know like how much of a role that was. And he also wrote an episode or co-wrote an episode. So
yeah,
I've got a lot to celebrate.
Yeah, there's a lot to I'm as far as I'm aware from my research that I did, he wrote 2 of the episodes himself, I believe. So one was I think the episode that we're probably going to talk a lot about, which is aptly titled Fuck Disabled People. And I believe he also wrote just episode 7. So
cool.
so it's great to see that was, you know, he's not just there to play a character, and he's not there consulting as an actor, but he's actually a main writer. I think he was actually brought on to write first, and then the showrunner was like, I want you in the show as well.
Yeah,
So
right.
that was interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good to see like on both sides of the camera that there's that representation.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. What did you think first up, Luke?
Well, I thought, you know, episode 4, so fuck disabled people. I thought it was interesting because Ryan did an interview and he was sort of talking about, you know, sex scenes with Nyle Dimarco, who's obviously deaf, and he uses ASL in the show. That Nyle had to sort of rely on lip reading, and Ryan said that lip reading is only 33% accurate, which I think a lot of people sort of think, oh, he's deaf, or you can just read my lips and you'll be all right. But there's a lot of, you know, concentration that goes into it, and it's not that straightforward. So I thought it was really good that Ryan was very aware of that, and there was constant communication between Nyle and Ryan when, you know, sort of filming the episode, and just making sure that the communication was there and the understanding was there. So I thought that was really, really good.
Yeah.
So important, like that the sets are as accessible as they possibly can be. So yeah, I think that's really awesome. Steph, I'm really interested to hear these skeptical thoughts.
Yeah, look, look, there, as you said, there was a lot to celebrate about the show and representation. I mean, anytime we see any disabled or deaf characters in, you know, being full sexualized human beings, I think that's a win, because we do not see that regularly in mainstream media, which is a shame.
Yes.
But so that was great. I did have a problem with the two sort of in this ensemble, so Julian and Marvin. The first instance that they kind of have sex on the show, both characters are having sex with sex workers, and the sex is being paid for, which to me missed a very big opportunity, because it's driving home that people with disability, the only way we will have sex will be, you know, we're not seen in that way. We have to pay that kind of attention.
Yeah.
I just found it so really interesting that it wasn't just one character, and like that would have been one thing, but it was both, which really, really surprised me. So
yeah, it's really interesting, because I think there's like a lot to unpack with like the sex worker representation in the show as well as a whole.
True.
And that's like a whole other conversation. But I get where you're coming from, because the storyline with Julian is that his brother actually sort of like tricks him into having sex with a sex worker, because so he pays, which is Nyle Dimarco's character, pays.
Which is kind of interesting, because the sex worker is the deaf character. So it's kind of like there's representation on both sides there, which is interesting. But yeah, like again, tricked into having someone else pay for sex for him. So that was interesting.
And I actually kind of like the storyline, because I like that they've like unpacked this whole idea that society thinks that disabled people just can't have sex, and that the only way they're going to be able to have sex is to pay for it. And there's nothing wrong with sex work, obviously, but I do think that there's something hugely wrong with this idea that disabled people can't just have, you know, normal, healthy sex lives like non-disabled people can.
And I will say, like, both characters do go on to have, you know, relationships with other people on the show. But I guess I've read a lot of like articles and sort of reviews on the show as well. And across the board, a lot of people were saying that these two characters, their storylines, they could have gone further, but they were a little undercooked. Like after the initial kind of getting with these two characters that they do eventually sort of have relationships with, there's not there's kind of like, it kind of goes a little flat. There's not a lot of, you know, obviously other characters are more prioritized in the series, and it's difficult with an ensemble cast. You can't prioritize everyone, but yeah, it's just, I don't know, it just missed a few marks for me. But again, like, love the sex positivity, all about that.
Yes.
But yeah, it's difficult, and this is, to be fair, it's nice to be talking about sort of these complexities, because again, we don't usually have the chance to talk about these complexities because they don't usually exist. So it's nice to be able to talk about it this way, and, you know, pick apart what is, you know, pretty good representation. But, you know, just, we always want more, right? We always want it to be just that little bit better. Yeah.
Exactly. Better and more.
Yes. Yeah.
I think one thing I also wanted to point out is there's a part where Marvin says to Julian, how can his heart be accessible when the world around him isn't? I thought that was really interesting. And I hope this isn't too personal of a question, because you can obviously just say skip it and we'll edit this out. But I don't know if you have faced a lot of discrimination within like the queer community being a person who's deaf, because I know as a disabled person myself, I have. And a lot of the time it's not super aggressive or blatant. But it's interesting to see that within marginalized communities like the queer community, there's still a lot of discrimination.
I think I've definitely like sort of gone through the mill with the whole apps thing, you know, like Grindr, Tinder, and all of that. And some guys, you know, they've said to me, oh, in your photo you wear a hearing aid, what's that about? And then I'll sort of explain, and I'll say that I'm deaf. But what I used to do was I used to sort of overcompensate. So I'd say stuff like, oh, I'm deaf, but don't worry, I can still talk and I can still wear hearing aids, so I can still hear what you're saying when I wear hearing aids. And it was almost like I was trying to reassure them that, you know, I can still sort of like be normal and stuff like that. And then I just sort of had like a turning point, and it just sort of switched, and I don't explain my deafness to anyone because I don't need to do that. I don't need to justify it. I am deaf and that's that. And then on the flip side, I've just had some guys who, you know, I've been talking to them quite a bit, and then they found out that I'm deaf, and I've just been instantly blocked. And I think a lot of, I'm not saying all of them, but I think the majority of the queer community, unfortunately, do think that if you're not a 10 out of 10, like, you know, you're a Ken doll, you're perfect, six pack, this, that, and the other, any sort of like difference is just seen as no. And I think for them, they just rather block and just move on to the next one, rather than look behind the disability and look behind the photos and things like that. So it has been difficult when it, you know, dating and hookups and all of that, when my deafness come into play. Then weirdly, I've also been like fetishized and stuff. So I've had comments, and they've sort of said, oh, you know, I want to have sex with you, but I want to take your hearing aid out and stuff like that. And it's just really weird, and I just find it so inappropriate. And I'm just like, why would you even ask that? I don't even really know who you are, and you sort of saying stuff like that, it just doesn't sit right with me. So then I've ended up blocking them. So it's definitely like swings and roundabouts, but I think as I've gotten older, because I'm a bit more like cutthroat and just I'm more stronger with my deaf identity, and I don't explain myself to anyone now. If they want to get to know me, then that's that. Do you know what I mean? I don't need to explain being deaf. So yeah.
100%. Yeah. I mean, sadly, I mean, yeah, those issues are not exclusive to the queer community. I think, you know, every disabled person or person with some sort of difference, you know, sadly faces, you know, this kind of weird, you know, interactions, reactions, all of that, you know, when we are sort of out in the dating world, or, you know, trying to make that human connection with other people, you know, because we are capable of doing that and we want that. So, but again, this is why it's so important to see more people with disabilities and, you know, some sort of difference in, you know, sexual, romantic, all kinds of relationships in film, TV, mainstream media, because until more people are exposed to the possibility of that, and that it is a reality, sadly, these assumptions and misguided thoughts are going to continue permeating society, which is really frustrating and really such a shame, because I think, we can bring a lot to a relationship. People just need to find out.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's funny as well, because I think we said this earlier. It's almost as if society think that if you're disabled, then you're just in the house and you haven't got a life and you just sort of sit there doing nothing. Do you know what I mean? So I think it is really refreshing and really important that we do see in mainstream media disabled people actually having lives, and just having fun, because that's everything that we do. And it's like important to get that message out and not show that the old stigmas and stuff like that.
I thought it was really interesting with Marvin's character, which is kind of why I brought up that quote before. He was very strong and sassy to begin with. And then as the season sort of went on, there was a bit of like a breakdown in that character, in that they revealed a bit of insecurity, and it was all kind of around sex and the way that they were treated by, the rest of the queer community. So I just thought that was like a really interesting way to show how ableism externally becomes internal, and it affects us ourselves and the way that we do view ourselves. No matter how strong we actually put up a wall kind of around us, it does like permeate through, and it does affect you, and it's only like you can't control that.
I think that's interesting, because Ryan O'Connell, he's talked about, like, and Special deals a lot with it, that internalized ableism, and he's talked a lot about how he has lived with that a lot. So I think it's interesting that is like coming through quite clearly in the writing of it as well. So we're not immune to, all of that feedback that we have throughout our lives certainly weighs heavily on us, and we start to, that's obviously going to come into our own thoughts about ourselves and self-worth and that. So that's why we need to break that down. Stop doing that.
So I wanted to touch on the Fuck Disabled People episode again, just because like there was some really interesting things that I picked up in interviews with Ryan. And that is apparently in that episode, it's the episode with the most sex scenes, which probably isn't that surprising, considering they have like a disabled sex orgy. I think they called it a crip rave.
Yeah.
I thought that was so cool. That there was like accessibility features explored.
They talk about they talk about Hoyer lifts. They're like, we needed to move this out of the way for the Hoyer lifts to come in. I'm like, oh my god, like wow.
I've actually thought about this. Yeah, I just thought that was like really interesting, and obviously something that I've never seen before in any other show, which just makes me even more sad that it got axed and that it's not coming back. Well, I think that's enough really unpacking Queer as Folk. I really enjoyed chatting to both of you about it. And now it's time to give our score on our completely made up scale called the Inclusive Disability Representation Scale. 5 being the absolute best disability representation you have ever seen, and 0 or negative numbers, if you want to be really harsh, looking at you, Steph, is the absolute worst disability representation. So we'll start with you, Steph. What was your score out of 5?
This is a really tough one. I feel like I say this with every score that I give. I preface it by saying this is really tough. But this one especially, because like, again, I love seeing people with disabilities in this sex positive light, because we don't see that usually. So for that, I want to give it a high score. But again, I did have a lot of issues with the storylines, with the characters themselves. I did find the show also as a whole a little bit preachy at times. There was a particular instance with a straw that I found a little bit preachy, but anyway, I'll leave you guys to watch the Fuck Disabled People episode. Long story short, I'm gonna give it a 2.5 out of 5.
Ooh.
So halfway in the middle.
Luke?
I'm gonna go down the middle. I'm gonna give it a 3, just because I feel like with the storylines and stuff like that, like what Steph said, I feel like they could have pushed it and they could have gone a little bit further with it. So it wasn't bad, but it wasn't amazing. So halfway down the middle, 3.
I was a 4. I don't know why, but I just bloody loved it.
That's it. I thought you were gonna love it, because I remember you said something a couple of weeks ago and you're like, I'm so excited to talk about this one, because like I just loved it and I binged it. I'm like, okay, interesting. So
and so you just naturally had to pick it to pieces.
I need to ruin it for you, of course.
literally. No, I'm just sad that it got axed, because I also think that with, you know, Ryan as a executive producer and a writer, they would have had more space to really unpack a lot more and go further. And I think that's a big shame.
It's a shame they don't have the opportunity to expand on what they started, because it was obviously there were a lot of beginnings to these characters that could have been expanded on, but yeah, sadly we won't get the chance.
Yes, and then until they make another reboot.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much to both of you for joining me this week. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on, Luke. So happy that you made some time for us. And anybody who's looking for the best Christmas shirts or jumpers ever, head over to Luke's website. We'll have to put the link when we share this on social media. That's what we'll do. Yeah, because they're iconic, honestly. All those puns, I love it. Thank you as well to everyone who is watching along or listening along. We want to hear what you thought about the Queer as Folk reboot. You can let us know your thoughts, your IDR scores on social media. If you search podcast ReFramed or ReFramed podcast, we're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And you can also email us at hello@reframedpodcast.com. And just before we finish, I just want to say a huge thank you to the Community Broadcasting Foundation for helping to fund this series. Thank you again, Steph and Luke. Bye. This has been a production of Attitude Foundation.